Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation, featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 782 for September 1st, 2019. Coming up in a few minutes.
When I taste that, it brings me back to the old site, and in the morning at around 6:30 when we started to do the first runnings, they're probably closer to 7, we'd steam some up with some milk and have like a fortified malted milk straight from the mash tun.
I'm back from Australia and almost back to normal after getting over the virus I brought home that knocked me out of commission for a week. Last time around, we looked at the artisans making single malt whiskey in Tasmania, and this time around we'll visit two of Australia's major mainland cities, where distillers are scaling up to make their whiskeys more affordable and more available worldwide without losing any of the craft. We'll tour the Starward Distillery in Melbourne and Sydney's Archie Rose later on WhiskyCast In-Depth. That's just ahead, along with a lot of news, a haiku contest winner on Your Voice, and of course the What I'm Tasting This Week department, or at least what I was tasting before the virus hit. We'll also have the definitive answer to the age-old question, just how long do you legally have to age a whiskey anyway? Make sure your battery's charged up because we've got a lot to cover. It's all just ahead on this non-contagious edition of WhiskyCast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
When you land on something special, you just know. Redbreast, the quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey, and a proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Pernod Ricard's American spending spree continues. This time around, the target is Castle Brands, which makes Jefferson's Bourbon, along with the Naphog Castle and Clontarf Irish whiskies, Gosling's Rum, and other brands. Pernod Ricard has agreed to pay $223 million for the publicly traded company that was founded by Mark Andrews back in 1988. The deal gives Pernod a bigger piece of the bourbon business with Jefferson's, which sold 89,500 cases of whiskey during the last fiscal year. Company executives did not discuss the future for Naphog Castle and Clontarf after the deal closes. That's expected by the end of the year, pending regulatory approval. And since Pernod's Irish Distillers unit sold its Paddy Irish whiskey brand in 2016 to focus on its premium Irish whiskey brands, it is possible that one or both brands might be placed on the market. This is the third acquisition for Pernod Ricard in the last 3 months. In June, the company's U.S.-based venture capital unit bought a majority stake in Kentucky's Rabbit Hole Distilling, and Pernod announced a deal back in July to buy Firestone and Robertson Distilling in Fort Worth, Texas. One additional note, if you saw some news reports online this week on the Castle Brands acquisition, you might have raised your eyebrows a bit at the list of brands said to be included in the sale, specifically Isle of Arran Scotch Whisky, the Robert Burns Scotch Whiskies, and Macri Moore Scotch Whisky. They're all part of Isle of Arran Distillers, which exports its whiskies to the U.S. through Castle Brands. That contract may be part of the sale, but there's no word on whether the relationship will continue once the deal closes. We'll have more details on that as they become available. The Castle Brands announcement came Thursday in Paris as Pernod Ricard released its annual financial report, and there was one other bit of news in that report. We've talked a lot about the growing demand for whiskey in China, and Pernod Ricard has now broken ground on a $140 million distillery in Sichuan province. The Amishan Malt Whiskey Distillery is expected to open in 2021, and will have a visitors center projected to handle up to 2 million guests a year. The move would allow Pernod Ricard to satisfy demand for whiskey in China without risking exposure to international trade tariffs. On that note, Brown-Forman reported its first quarter fiscal year earnings this week. The results were mixed as earnings per share beat Wall Street expectations, but sales missed the mark for the fourth straight quarter. While sales remained strong in the U.S. and emerging global markets, the impact of tariffs led to a 3% drop in sales to developed export markets, and that includes a 1% overall decline worldwide for Jack Daniel's. Brown-Forman's bourbon portfolio showed a 16% increase in sales growth worldwide, but overall, gross profits for the company during the quarter fell by 5% on the tariffs and higher prices for raw materials. How about some good news now? The Scotch Whisky Association's mid-year analysis of UK revenue and customs export data shows strong growth in export sales during the first half of 2019. The value of exports grew by nearly 11% to around £2.2 billion, while export volume grew by 7.1%. Single malts now account for 30% of all Scotch whisky exports. Okay, the news isn't all that good when you dig down a bit into the numbers. Turns out producers increased their shipments in anticipation of a no-deal Brexit or to key markets where they might face new tariffs. And we're expecting an announcement out of Washington any day now on whether the U.S. will keep whiskies on its list of European goods to be hit with tariffs in the ongoing dispute with the European Union over aircraft subsidies. On that note, and this might make some people nervous, for years now the U.S. has ranked a distant second behind France in terms of exports by volume. That's calculated in the equivalent of 70 cl bottles. But for the first time in memory, the U.S. is not number 2. While exports to France fell by almost 12%, shipments to India skyrocketed during the first half of the year by 56%. And with U.S. exports down 6% during the period, India moved into second place on the list by nearly 10 million bottles. The U.S. still ranks first in terms of exports by value, with a value of £487 million. That's up by almost 20% during the period. Meanwhile, the SWA has settled its legal dispute with the Virginia Distillery Company. As we reported back in July, the association filed a lawsuit in federal court over Virginia Distillery's use of the word Highland on the labels for its Virginia Highland whiskey. That whiskey is blended from the distillery's own whiskey and imported malt whiskey from Scotland. Virginia Distillery's Gareth Moore told us in an email the company will be allowed to sell off its existing stocks using the Virginia Highland label, but the distillery will retire the brand at that point. Virginia Distillery will start releasing its own Courage and Conviction single malt whiskeys next year. And finally, this is a big week for Scotch Malt Whisky Society members. The Gathering is bringing together members from all over the world this week at the Society's headquarters at the Vaults in Leith. SMWS Global Ambassador John McShane will lead a virtual tasting online this Saturday, but there's plenty to do all week long.
There's lots of pairing tastings, events at the Vaults with some distillery people, and the whole range of that garden party at the weekend. Hopefully we won't get typical Scottish weather, but there's a garden party outside in the courtyard at the Vaults. There's the virtual tasting, and there's there's walks around Leith describing the history of Leith as a food and drinks port, a wine and spirits port. So yeah, all happening.
Satellite events are being held through the month at SMWS chapters in Europe, and the U.S. chapter will hold a series of events from the 17th through the 21st with Chairman Paul Skipworth in New York, Chicago, Miami, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. You'll find a link for details at WhiskyCast.com. And that's where you can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long. The news is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Keeping American whiskey history and tradition alive isn't just a marketing slogan, it's part of Heaven Hill's fabric. When other distillers were getting out of the rye whiskey business, Heaven Hill saved the legendary Rittenhouse rye from becoming a footnote in the history books. Today, it's the rye whiskey of choice, in a cocktail or neat, with a distinct spicy flavor all its own. Find out more at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely. Drink wisely. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. September is always a busy month, and this year is no exception. Maltstock starts off the month this coming weekend in Nijmegen, the Netherlands, along with Spirit of Speyside, distilled in Elgin, Scotland. The Whiskey Extravaganza's fall series of events starts on the 12th in Chicago. The Hometown Rising Country Music and Bourbon Festival is on the 14th and 15th in Louisville, Kentucky, followed by Bourbon and Beyond the following weekend. Whiskies of the World is on the 19th in Houston and the 21st in Austin, Texas. Whiskey Live China is on the 21st and 22nd in Changsha, and the Chicago Indie Spirits Expo is coming up on the 25th. The Stockholm Beer and Whiskey Festival kicks off the first of its 2 weekends on the 26th in Sweden, and the Whiskey Show is in London on the 28th and 29th. There's plenty more going on this month, though, and throughout the year. Right now, we have 184 different events on our searchable calendar at whiskycast.com. And if you have a festival, a tasting, or other whiskey-related event you'd like to add to the list, just use the contact form at the website to let us know all about it.
The search never ends, but it's nice when you can come in for a landing, pause and explore the silky smoothness of single pot still Irish whiskey, matured in the finest bourbon and Oloroso sherry casks. Land on Redbreast, then be sure to pass it on. Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Mortlach. Australian whiskies have been pretty hard to find and pretty expensive when you can find them. That's because most of the distilleries down under, especially in Tasmania, have been largely small-scale producers focusing on single cask bottlings because of limited capacity. Back in 2011, I predicted that Australian whiskies could become as popular worldwide one day as Australian wines, if they could ever scale up production to a competitive level. We are now starting to see the scalability factor kick in. In 2016, Starward Distillery moved from its original site in a hangar at Melbourne's Essendon Fields Airport to a much larger facility in the Port Melbourne neighborhood near downtown. That move allowed Starward to boost production from 90,000 liters of alcohol a year to around 300,000 now, and gradually expand its exports from the UK and Europe to the United States, where its Nova single malt went on sale earlier this year, and the twofold blend of wheat and malt whiskies debuts this month. I had the chance to tour Starward's distillery with founder David Vitale and distiller Jared Stern.
Let's get started. We'll begin with malted barley, I guess. That sort of feels like it's a good way to start.
David Vitale started his career at Tasmania's Lark Distillery, working for the godfather of Australian whiskey, Bill Lark. But he and Lark didn't quite see eye to eye on scaling up production, so, with his mentor's blessing, he returned to Melbourne to open Starward.
So, before moving into this site, a lot of what you saw in Tasmania was what we were using as well to produce whiskey. So it was a Natlua 1800 litre wash still and a 600 litre spirit still. The big difference was, as you probably noticed, that they were really struggling to get through one batch a day, like a 12-hour run was typically the timeline for them in Tasmania. And one of the things that we were really keen on when we started Starward was to kind of really focus on making as much booze as we possibly could, particularly given that there's a lot of fixed costs involved in running a distillery, and the more booze you made, the more you could spread that over lots of whiskey and get that price point down. So we really focused on, I guess, making some decisions about the way we mature our whiskey, well, the way we make our wash and ferment it and distill it with that in mind. And so what we've done along the way, I guess, as we've scaled up, is found ways to keep the craft, but just be smarter about the way that we approach production, so that we're able to meet the demand for the whiskey. So unfortunately, we kind of misstepped last year and ran out of whiskey in September, which is the first time ever since we were open that we'd actually run out. That's with a double gold, best in class and all these other awards through the way. We're always able to meet demand, but September last year we kind of just in time for Father's Day in Australia ran out of whiskey. But up until then we've always been able to supply the market, and that's been off the back of really going deep and being thinking about the opportunity for a whiskey that's at an accessible price point and really chasing that. So in 2016 we moved from Essendon Fields to Port Melbourne, and with that move we decided to upgrade a lot of the equipment. In fact, apart from some of the fermenters that we're using for holding tanks now, everything that you see over there was basically purchased, not necessarily new, but was purchased and implemented to scale up. So a really straightforward process to making Starward. Obviously, we've discussed before that my first passion was beer. So a lot of influence in terms of the way that we approach the malting of the barley, the mashing and fermentation takes as much out of microbrewing that as it does from traditional Scotch whisky production, and that's been something that has been really encouraging to see also in the American single malt world. That I think it lends itself as much to craft beer as it does whiskies from other places, and in that context, there are a lot of things that we jettisoned and left behind. There's no underback here. There's no kind of, we don't lauder into another tun. It just basically goes from the mash tun into the fermenters. And we just kind of think of this as making a great beer to start off with.
And that means the brewers are just as important to the process as the distillers, especially in a somewhat finicky environment.
It's fussy, right?
Fussy. It's very, very fussy. So the brewers that work here each day, that's their only job, just to work on the brew and just baby it through, monitor the whole process and make sure nothing goes wrong. Because as soon as something goes wrong quick. And
they use two types of yeast, a standard distiller's yeast and one designed to enhance fruity flavors in the wash.
Is that the way it's supposed to taste? Is that what it should be, David?
It's good.
It's quite sweet.
It's very sweet.
Yeah.
So
pumpkin.
One of my earliest memories, like when I taste that, it brings me back to the old site. And in the morning at around 6:30, when we started to do the first runnings, they're probably closer to 7, we'd steam some up with some milk and have like a fortified malted milk straight from the mash tun. Yeah, and explains a lot of my girth. Yeah.
Sorry.
So that's dialed in. Lots of esters, right? Lots of tropical fruits, really quite aromatic. There's clove characteristic. So lots of that kind of baseline new make spirit character is baked in right here with that fermentation. And I guess the difference between just using the standard distilling yeast and this yeast is the fruit profile. Typically it's apples and pears are typically what you're going to get from that standard yeast. Think Glenfiddich. This is kind of just fruit bomb.
That and filling the casks at 55% ABV instead of the usual 62.5% result in a whiskey that's mature in what Vitale refers to as 3 Melbourne years, a little more than 2 years on the calendar. Part of the reason is the climate, where temperatures can swing wildly from day to night and from day to day all year long.
Early on, we weren't going to have time on our side for a few reasons. The economics of a startup distillery don't lend itself to long maturation periods, but importantly, the climate that we mature our whiskey in is also quite dramatic and very different to Scotland. And so without time on your side to kind of have flavour develop entirely in oak, we kind of had a mindset of laddering up flavour and starting right here at, with malted, darker coloured malted barley, and obviously a very, very, very strong ester profile to the wort. And it's very different. Living in Seattle now, I've obviously gone to Westland, who are kind of pioneering the same sort of mindset. Obviously going a lot deeper with mash bill. Westward, basically a craft beer that's been turned into a whiskey. And those same philosophy, very, very, very different profile to the wash that gets distilled. I think we kind of, if it was an arm wrestle on fruit, there'd be no contest.
Starward's racks, both at the distillery and a nearby warehouse, are filled with Australian red wine casks, mostly European oak, and usually arrive direct from the wineries after being used for 4 to 7 years. While some get shaved, toasted, and recharred, most go straight from wine to whiskey, adding more fruitiness to the spirit.
And because of those, the age of the wine barrels and the style of wine that we're kind of using, there's a lot of length that comes with the whiskey that we don't have to necessarily add faints into to kind of get. So there's a lot of philosophical kind of changes that we've had, that differentiates what Tasmanian whiskey is to what certainly Starward is. And I think that's going to be an interesting part of the evolution of a category over time. I have a fundamental view that a lot of drinkers don't really want to necessarily get caught up in the process part of it, and it's really about what is this doing to me in the mouth. Fundamentally there's a very clear mindset with us that each of the parts of the process are laddering up flavour, as opposed to necessarily being a place where we're going to have to deal with something later on.
If you believe that a whiskey has terroir, that sense of place, Starward's doesn't necessarily come from its barley, the water supply, or the casks. It may be hard to describe in a tasting note, but the Starward terroir comes from Melbourne itself.
So much of what we do is influenced by Melbourne. We were really inspired, I guess, of this kind of food and wine scene and the drinks culture in Melbourne, the small bar scene. So we just wanted to be closer to it and, in a way, be a bit of a gift back to the city of Melbourne as well.
As opposed to Tasmania, right?
Of course, and Melbourne's my hometown as well. And even though I learned how to make whiskey in Tasmania, and what better place in the world to do that, this was always going to be a Melbourne-based distillery. There's just so much for us to kind of celebrate, I guess, with all of the things that we do so well, this kind of fusion of old and new with food and applying that to the world of whiskey.
By the way, Starward's pot stills have a unique heating system. They're not direct fired, and there isn't a set of pipes that carries steam through the bottom of the still. Instead, the wash or the spirit is circulated through a heat exchanger that heats it up outside the still and returns it to the pot. The process is more energy efficient and makes the cleaning process between still runs a lot easier. Diageo's Distill Ventures venture capital unit owns a piece of Starward and has been looking at the technology for use at other distilleries. As of now, Starward is Australia's largest whiskey distillery, but that is about to change. The Archie Rose Distilling Company in Sydney's Rosebery neighborhood released its first rye whiskey in July and has single malt in the barrel along with its other spirits. Master distiller Dave Withers took us on a 2-stop tour.
This is sort of us. So we sort of started up 5 years ago. As you can see, we've thoroughly outgrown this space. As you can tell from our weird DIY table and other sort of things over there. We're at the moment just sort of finishing up one of the brews, and the sort of stills on the way. And this is sort of us. So
It's very simple, but still very complex because you do a lot here, don't you?
Yeah, we do. So yeah, we do white spirits and sort of dark spirits as well. So the rye whiskey, single malt whiskey, gin. So there's a little sort of gin still just around the corner we can't quite get to at the moment. But yeah, it's a pretty unique sort of place.
Tell me about the complexity that you guys have done with the rye, because you guys are doing stuff that isn't widely done in Australia and really isn't done in a lot of other places either.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, we're trying to use a bit of sort of malted rye, which is a little bit different in Australia, and trying to use a few sort of heirloom varieties and sort of different, basically play a bit of attention to the actual grain itself and make sure that has enough sort of runway and given enough voice.
How does Australian rye differ from rye in other continents?
Very different, yeah. It's quite interesting. We've tried American, German, and different types of Australian rye as well, and they do vary quite a lot. So at the moment, we're still kind of refining exactly where we want to go with that, but we're moving forward with an heirloom and also a sort of actually a more common sort of Australian rye for our malting purposes, yeah.
One of the samples you let us try earlier was this smoked malt, and the process you used was completely different, and I don't even want to try to explain it. I want you to explain it. How did you come up with this?
Yeah, so very different. So we actually took large blocks of ice and we actually smoked the ice with native ironbark wood. And then we used that water as the breakdown for the whiskey itself. So from sort of cask strength back down to 40% ABV.
And it tastes unbelievable compared to traditionally smoked malted rye, or if you can even call it traditional.
Yeah, well, that was the idea. I was to do something a little bit different, and the ironbark gives a very sort of savoury character to the final whiskey, which was really nice. We wanted to try something a little bit different and see if we didn't have to do this very inefficient process, which is sort of smoking the grain itself. Well, the water is pretty, it takes up a lot of that smoky character, so it sort of made sense to sort of cut out the middleman and just go straight to the water.
Turning to the single malts for a second, you haven't released one yet, but you're doing extremely complex single malts. I think Westland is the only other one I know of that's even close to this, and you're using 6 different styles of malt, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so we're using 6 different malts, each of which sort of contribute a very different flavour profile, and really trying to sort of build up that complexity of flavour in the final single malt and sort of pair that off with a lot of New South Wales ingredients, Australian sort of sherry casks, or we use the term Apera casks, and sort of give that very localised, uniquely Australian twist on the malt. I mean, Australia is one of the largest malt producing nations in the world. We're one of the 5th largest barley producer in the world. So it sort of makes sense that we would fall back on our growers and farmers to sort of put the best foot forward and give us some great tasting produce.
When will you release a single malt?
It'll probably be first quarter next year, so a little while away, but yeah, really excited to get it out.
Let's talk about the new distillery now, because as you noted, you've outgrown this one, but there's a new one under construction down the road, right?
Yeah, a little bit bigger. It'll be good to get down there and sort of show you around in a minute, but essentially very different, sort of taking a lot of the craft ideas that we have here and sort of small scale ideas and really giving them some runway and really dialing them up, amplifying them.
That's not all Withers and his colleagues are dialing up. The current distillery in a Rosebery retail park can make about 120,000 liters of spirits each year. The new Archie Rose Distillery at Port Bombay will have an annual capacity of 3 million liters. The construction site was the second stop on our tour, complete with hard hats and high-vis.
Yeah, so it's not a small site. So this is sort of the ground central and sort of the still house where we're standing. So this is probably the last big piece of the puzzle in front of us here, which will actually be, you can see the stills just back there actually, but there'll actually be 2 gin stills sort of dropping in where we are at right now. And all our deliveries coming through this giant door here. All our malt intake coming through into 8 dedicated 40-ton silos there.
I mean, it's an interesting sort of distillery in a way, and we have tried to sort of push a few sort of buttons in terms of innovation and really sort of dial up that whole sort of grain focus in a way. We may actually go up into the sort of mash house and sort of get a good proper view of how things sort of go from there.
This will essentially be Australia's biggest distillery when it opens, right?
Yeah, I think, is that not larger? Yeah, I think so. I believe it will be. In terms of capacity between both white and dark, definitely.
At what point do you start doing the calculations on how to scale up your mashes and everything into this larger facility?
Yeah, so it's a lot of very complex models really, but essentially we're doing things a little bit differently with the sort of profiling here, which we'll be able to tell you a little bit more about a few years down the track. But essentially the malt, as it sort of comes through the silos here, then get pushed through our sort of malt handling in there. We've got some pretty nice bits of kit in there. Some of that is provided, most of that is provided either by Buller, which is a very sort of well-known malt handling provider. And some of you may also notice the term Mura there, so which is a dead giveaway to what we're standing right next to now, which is a mash filter. So it's one of those really interesting things, I suppose, for us, that we really wanted to see how far we could push the mashing profile. And, you know, most distilleries use very traditional processes when they're making malt whiskey, which is, you know, using the mash tun. Mash filter has been used in a number of distilleries, but it's I think there's only 3 or 4 really on the larger side that are doing it. Some well-known brands that are doing some fairly innovative things. For us, we really wanted to give the malt a voice, and that meant that we had to have some flexibility built into the kit. It also meant that we had to basically overcome some fairly challenging processing. So rye is a very challenging grain, and if we want to lauter that off, we have to separate it from the wort somehow. Rye can be very sticky, so a mash filter works really well. It also is very good for the efficiencies as well. So if you know what you're doing and you dial it in well, you can get a really good flavour. High clarity of wort, which means you can get higher ester production as well, and allows us to get, I think, generally speaking, get between about 102 and 103% efficiency from your actual malt. So means you use less water as well, so it's more cost effective and energy efficient, better for the environment, as well as you can maximize your equipment and footprint and what have you as well. So a lot of kind of things that go to its favor, and Mura probably one of the best in the business when it comes to mash filters. It's a weird bit of kit in the sense that everyone thinks about it being quite innovative, and really I suppose in its new form it is quite new, but the mash filter idea has been around for over 100 years. It was sort of revitalized, I think, in the late 90s and sort of given a new lease on life then. But yeah, so that's sort of, I suppose, where we go to. So some of the different sort of stuff you see with this is hammer mill, which I think is a bit more common in sort of North America, you know, when you're sort of boiling things up. But certainly for lautering off or for single malt style production, that's pretty much not done unless you can pair that up with a mash filter. And it also allows some unique stuff. So we can capture all of the dust from the actual processing, which can amount to about 1.4% of the total amount of malt you use. And because we're effectively hammer milling it into a dust anyway, we can actually reuse that dust. So that's, you know, to the bottom line, and also to flavor profile, 1.4% of the total amount of malt that you're using, you can reincorporate into the process. So, so pretty innovative stuff. And this whole system comes with, you know, its own unique kind of stuff. So we've got a mashing station here, which is they call a mecha masher, as well as mash conversion vessel and sort of 2 sets of weak wort recovery, which is pretty unique. Yeah.
When does it open?
We'll be starting commissioning in November this year. Yeah, which is a long process. So it's, I suppose, it's a different sort of scale. So it is a reasonably automated plant, and the idea behind that is to, for me, I get a bit philosophical about this. So for me, I think it's really important to acknowledge our role as the distiller in the distilling art, which is that there's almost to this point, and even in this point, there's almost no part of this which is human. So, and what I mean by that is that, when you sow barley, and I truly believe whiskey starts in the field, it doesn't start in the distillery. When you grow barley or any kind of grain, that's Mother Nature's realm. Like, we think that we have a level of control over that by saying, we're going to plant this grain and it's going to grow. But really, all we're doing is playing by Mother Nature's rules. If we don't plant at the right time, we don't get enough rain and what have you, if the season isn't correct, we don't get what we want out of that. When we go to malt the grain, again, we're playing by Mother Nature's rules. We're really just trying to do the thing that the grain needs in order to facilitate it to germinate and do its thing. Even through mashing process, we're just using nature. It's like the basic raw materials that's developed through that malting process. So for me, I think that it's important to understand that while we're matching up this really hardcore innovation, actually essentially what we're doing is only guiding guiding Mother Nature. Like that, it's a hand-in-hand process between what is essentially natural and what we're doing in an industrial way. That got a bit deep, but we've had a few whiskeys, so.
Thanks to Dave Withers of Archie Rose Distilling Company and Starward's David Vitale. Full disclosure, I was in Australia as part of a press trip organized by Starward Whiskey, which also arranged for all of the other distillery visits on the tour. As always, full editorial control over the content of this episode remains with WhiskyCast. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Mortlach, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies, comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlach lineup at malts.com. Here's a bit of good news for you. We're welcoming a brand new sponsor for the What I'm Tasting This Week department this time around. Thanks to our friends at Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey for joining the WhiskyCast family. Let's be transparent. Since I've been under the weather since I got back from Australia last weekend, I tasted these whiskeys while I was still in Australia. And we'll start with the Starward Twofold Australian whiskey, which made its debut recently in Australia and is reaching the U.S. and other export markets now. It's a blend of Starward's own malt whiskey with wheat whiskey distilled at the Manildra Distillery in New South Wales using Australian wheat, but the whiskey is matured in Melbourne using Australian red wine casks. Twofold is bottled at 40% ABV. The nose is aromatic with a hint of brandy balanced by barley sugar, bread dough, honey, caramel, and brown sugar. The taste is crisp and clean with a good mouthfeel and touches of subtle baking spices, honey, vanilla, butterscotch candies, caramel, and hints of berries and fresh fruits in the background. The finish is long and gentle with subtle spices and hints of caramel, butterscotch, and brown sugar. I'm scoring the Starward Twofold a 92. Let's move on now to batch number 2 of Archie Rose's malted rye whiskey. It's bottled at 46% ABV. The nose has baking spices, toasted oak, a hint of molasses, dark honey, espresso, and graham crackers. The taste has great spices with cinnamon, black pepper, and a subtle hint of clove. They fade slowly to reveal honey, molasses, dried apricots, and vanilla. The finish is long and subtle with gentle spices and apricots that give it a mouth-watering, luscious touch. A number of our listeners in Australia have been bragging about Archie Rose's rye to me recently, and now I see why. I'm scoring the Archie Rose malted rye batch number 2 a 93. And let's take a look at the Adams Distillery's cask strength port cask from Perth. It's not the city on Australia's western coast that you might have heard of, but the tiny town of Perth in northeast Tasmania. Adams Distillery is named after its two founders, Adam Pinkard and Adam Saunders, and their whiskey is bottled at 55% ABV. The nose has red grapes along with pine needles and a hint of spearmint, balanced by raisins and toffee. The taste is nice and fruity with berry cobbler, balanced by clove, white pepper, raisins, and a hint of Christmas cake. The finish, long and fruity with just a hint of spice. I'm scoring the Adams Distillery Cask Strength Port Cask a 92. And one note, I do need to make a correction from the Tasting Notes segment in our last episode when I mentioned the Iron Horse Distillery's single malt. I should have called it the Iron House Distillery, and I'm sorry for the mistake. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey, where September the 13th is Rye Day the 13th. Find out more about Rye Day the 13th events around the U.S. and check out Sagamore Spirit's range of rye whiskeys at sagamorespirit.com. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 2,600 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at whiskycast.com.
From deep in the north, far beyond the wall, the howl of the frozen wind brings word of something new. A whiskey from the land of always winter, for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Let's open up the inbox now for Your Voice, brought to you by Lot 40. First off, I want to thank all of you for your patience and good thoughts this week. I got home last Saturday night after missing my connection and spending a 24-hour layover in Dallas feeling lousy. And by Sunday morning, it was even worse. Couldn't even sit down at my computer until the end of the week. So here are some of the tweets that came in. From the Whiskey Ninja in Canberra, Australia, this year's flu season was a right bastard. Knocked me for 6 despite getting jabbed. Hope you're better soon. And if you're not familiar with Australian slang, jabbed refers to a flu shot. Also from Australia, Rob at BrainSnap 1000 sent this. Copped a dose in Hobart a couple of months ago. It's brutal. Totally worth it to spend time in Tassie anyway. No arguments there, even though this is the first time in almost 14 years of WhiskyCast that I've missed a week. It feels good to get back to work, but I am tentatively penciling in a week off sometime in 2033. I was able to keep up on social media somewhat thanks to my iPad during the week, and I figured we might as well have some fun while I was under the weather. So here's the challenge I came up with on Twitter, and personally I blame the fever for this one. Come up with a classic Japanese-style haiku. 3 lines with 5 syllables in the first and third lines, 7 syllables in the middle line, and work in the word redbreast somewhere. Best haiku wins a redbreast pocket square and a WhiskyCast Glencairn glass. We had a lot of responses. Here are just a few. At Richelto tweeted this from Cato, New York. Redbreast in the glass, happiness is in the heart. Living the good life. I like that one. Our old friend Kevin Abrook, who recently retired from William Grant & Sons, shared this one. Unique, rare egg cracked, inside non-malted barley. Hatched, redbreast takes flight. Another old friend, Jinx writer Jeff Cialetti, added this one. I really don't care if it's 12 or 21. Just give me redbreast. Longtime listener Bunkai H went the extra mile. Sunsets on the moor. We dram chases cares out the door. Redbreast, drink of lore. The extra mile was an additional stanza. Haiku need not rhyme, but hey, since I had the time, redbreast so sublime. Eamon Hegarty tweeted this haiku from Northern Ireland. A redbreast to cure some ill that's found abroad, travels not for all. Jeff Edgar shared this from Canada. I thirst for knowledge and whiskey arcane delights, redbreast quenches all. And another Canadian, Jeff Pepone, tweeted this from Toronto. Hi, Robin Redbreast, eating fat worms on my lawn. Better you than me. I'll say that. And after a lot of thought, I've decided to pick more than one winner since we had so many great entries. Jeff Pepone wins for Best Non-Whiskey Haiku. Jeff Edgar and At Richelto both win for Best Philosophical Haiku. Eamon Hegarty wins for Best Illness-Related Haiku. Jeff Cioletti wins for Best Haiku Likely to Wind Up Being Used in a Redbreast Ad. And Bunkai H wins for Best Overall Effort, not only for submitting 2 haikus that also rhymed, but threw in a limerick to boot. There once was vodka from Nantucket. Went to try before I chuck it. I had to compare to Redbreast that's there. Now vodka's thrown in a bucket. Thanks again to everyone who submitted haikus. I'll be getting in touch with the winners to get your mailing addresses. In the meantime, if you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Your Voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's award-winning 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Let's wrap things up now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and all that other stuff that combine to make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. We know that most countries define whiskey as a distilled spirit made from a mash of cereal grains and matured in oak barrels, and that most countries define a specific length of time for that maturation. Most countries that have a minimum specify 3 years. Australia requires at least 2. And then there's the United States, where unless you're making a straight whiskey that requires at least 2 years of maturation, there is no specific length of time, as long as that amount of time is disclosed on the label if it's younger than 4 years. That is 5 seconds of silence. And according to the U.S. government, that's all that new make spirit has to spend in a barrel now to legally be called a whiskey in the U.S. Matt Brune is the CEO of Pabst Blue Ribbon, the venerable beer brand that's inspired hipsters and hangovers for generations, and the brand has now released a new Blue Ribbon whiskey, complete with the age statement, aged 5 seconds. When Brune and his team at PBR teamed up with New Holland Distilling in Michigan 2 years ago to create Blue Ribbon whiskey, they originally wanted to label it an unaged white whiskey, but the TTB said no.
We said, well, what do you want us to register it as? And we had some discussions, and we said, look, what if we registered it as a whiskey? They said, yeah, sure, but whiskey requires aging. We said, okay, is there a determinant on how long it needs to be aged? They said, no. We said, okay, cool. Well, we're going to age it for 5 seconds. They said, that's fine as long as you declare it on the label. So we honestly and authentically just age it for 5 seconds, and it's written there on the label.
Okay, I'm going to ask, how do you pull it off for 5 seconds? Running it over wood through a barrel or what?
It's flow rate. No, it's flow rate. So it comes off the still. There's a barrel between the still and the bottling line, and we just control the flow rate. So the whiskey flows into the barrel and flows out at a flow rate that allows it to contact the wood for 5 seconds.
And you don't have to use a new barrel, right?
No, it's not bourbon.
It certainly is not a bourbon, but it turns out there is a historical precedent for Blue Ribbon whiskey. Jacob Best started his company in Milwaukee back in 1844, and apparently started out making whiskey before he switched to beer. His son-in-law Frederick Pabst eventually took over the company and put his own name on the brand. I do have a bottle of the Pabst Blue Ribbon whiskey, and will post my tasting notes for it soon at the WhiskyCast website. By the way, Matt Brun says there are barrels of Blue Ribbon aging in a warehouse now, but there are no plans yet to release an aged version. If you have something you'd like us to look at on Behind the Label, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copperpot, a unique triple distilled premium Irish whiskey, combining single malt and single pot still. First fashioned in the 1700s and still a rarity today. Sure, as we say in Ireland, what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copperpot.
That's all for this episode of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find links for our WhiskyCast HD videos and the WhiskyCast tasting panel, along with the latest whiskey news, tasting notes, the whiskey photo of the week, and a complete archive of past episodes that goes all the way back to 2005. Want to make sure you never miss a single episode of WhiskyCast? All you have to do is click on the subscribe button in your favorite podcast app, and that way you'll get every episode as soon as it drops. You can also listen to WhiskyCast on your home smart speaker, too. We love to hear from you. You can get in touch with us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
When you land on something special, you just know. Redbreast, the quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey, and a proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2019, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Until next time, thanks for listening.